How many people in the entire world truly know who you are? Not who you appear to be, not the version of you that shows up in photos, that responds to messages, that smiles at gatherings. The real version, with your fears, your contradictions, your thoughts, you've never said out loud to anyone. Think for a moment. With brutal honesty, most people, when they genuinely ask themselves this question, arrive at a number that frightens them, a number far smaller than they expected, and some arrive at a number that stops them cold, because they realize that perhaps no one, absolutely no one, truly knows who they are on the inside. This isn't ordinary loneliness. This is something deeper. It's the kind of isolation that exists inside relationships, inside friendships of years, inside entire families, invisible from the outside, devastating from within. Socrates lived this. And not only lived it, he spent decades investigating exactly this phenomenon in the streets of Athens. Talking with politicians, artists, philosophers, merchants, soldiers, people of every class, every level of intelligence, every social position. And what he found was always the same thing, repeated endlessly, disguised in different forms but identical in essence. People don't know themselves, and because of that, they are completely incapable of knowing others. But Socrates didn't stop at observation. He developed something, a method, a way of questioning so precise, so surgically simple, that it exposed in minutes what years of living together conceal. A method he applied against powerful politicians, celebrated poets, the most respected men of his era. And that left all of them, without exception, without an answer. And here is the detail that changes everything. The questions he asked were not complex. They didn't require philosophical training. They weren't elaborate traps. They were simple, direct. The kind of question that anyone, upon hearing it, immediately thinks, "That's easy. I know the answer to that." And that's exactly where the method begins to work. Because the confidence with which a person believes they'll answer says more about them than any answer they could give. And the moment that confidence collapses, the moment they realize they don't know what they thought they knew, that moment has a name. Socrates called it aporia, the impasse, the point where the ground disappears beneath your feet. You've been at that point before, maybe without knowing the name, maybe without understanding what was happening, that strange feeling of realizing that someone you've known for years reacted in a way you never would have predicted, that they said something that didn't match who you thought they were. That, at the moment of truth, they simply weren't there. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't a phase. That was reality revealing itself, the way it always does, at the moment you are least prepared to see it. Socrates was sentenced to death for asking these questions, not because they were aggressive, but because they were true. And Athens, like any social structure built on collective illusions, cannot survive contact with the truth for very long. What he discovered, and how it changes the way you see every person around you, is what begins now. But before we continue, I need to ask you something. If you've made it this far, if something in these first words touched something real inside you, that already says a lot about who you are. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding exactly this kind of reflection. You didn't avoid it, you stayed. So it makes sense that you be part of this for real. Hit the like button now, not for the number, but because that simple gesture says this kind of content matters, that you want more conversations like this, that real philosophy applied to real life has value. And every like makes this video reach more people who are going through exactly what you've been through, or are going through right now. And in the comments, I want to ask you a direct question. Can you think of someone, just one person, who truly knows you? Not the version you present, the version you actually are. Write it down below. It can be just a word. It can be an entire story. This space is yours. We read every comment, and many times it's in the comments that the most important conversations on this channel happen. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and activate the bell. Not out of habit, but because what's coming in the next videos in this series will continue exactly where this one leaves off. Socrates is just the beginning. There is a sequence being built here, a line of thought that video by video changes the way you see people, bonds, and yourself. You won't want to lose the thread. Now let's continue. There is a belief that almost every human being carries, so deep, so rooted, that almost no one ever stops to question it. A belief that forms in childhood, consolidates in adolescence, and arrives in adulthood with the force of absolute certainty. And that belief says this: the people around me know me. It seems obvious, doesn't it? It seems almost unnecessary to question. After all, what does it mean to be close to someone if not to know them? What do years of coexistence, conversations, shared experiences mean if not the construction of real knowledge about who the other person is? This is exactly where Socrates began, and this is exactly where most people stumble without ever realizing they've fallen, because there is a fundamental, brutal, and nearly invisible difference between two things we spend our entire lives confusing: knowing someone and being accustomed to someone. These are two completely different experiences. They produce similar feelings. They create the same illusion of security. But when life tests that difference, and it always does, the result is completely opposite. Being accustomed to someone means you've learned their patterns. You know how they react in common situations. You know their tastes, their habits, the way they laugh, what irritates them, what pleases them. You've built a mental map of them. And that map works well in everyday life, in routine conversations, in predictable situations. But that map is not the person. That map is the version of them that showed up in the situations you lived through together. It's the version they allowed you to see. It's the version they themselves believe they are, and which many times is also not real. Truly knowing someone is something else. It's different in essence. It means having access not to patterns, but to roots, not to surface behavior, but to the values underneath everything, to the contradictions the person carries without being able to resolve, to fears that were never said out loud, to beliefs that govern every decision without them even noticing, to the core, to what stays the same when everything around changes. And here is the question Socrates was asking, not with words, but through every conversation he began in the streets of Athens. How many people around you have access to that core? How many people know you at that level? Not your routine, not your appearance, not your social version. You, the being that exists beneath all of that. For most people, the answer is uncomfortable, not because they're surrounded by bad people, but because they never made this distinction. They never realized they spent years, sometimes decades, being seen without being known, being observed without being understood, being loved many times for a version of themselves that isn't completely real. This has a name in modern psychology: false intimacy. The feeling of depth without the actual depth. The comfort of presence without the vulnerability of genuine self-knowledge. It's one of the most common patterns in human relationships, and one of the most silently destructive. Socrates didn't have this term, but he had something more valuable: the ability to identify this pattern in real time, in front of the person, in the middle of a conversation, and to do it in a way that the person themselves could not deny. Think with me for a moment. Think about someone close. A friend, a partner, a family member, someone you would say without hesitation knows you well. Now ask a simple question. Does this person know what you fear most? Not the surface fear, not the fear of heights or spiders. The real fear, the one that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning. the one that shapes your decisions without you realizing it, the one you rarely admit even to yourself. Does this person know? If the answer came slowly, if it came with hesitation, if it came accompanied by a maybe or an internal silence, pay attention to that silence, because it's telling you something important. Socrates said the greatest obstacle to self-knowledge was not lack of intelligence, not lack of time, nor lack of interest. It was the comfort of illusion, the fact that believing we are known, even if that belief is false, gives us a sense of security that is extremely difficult to give up. Because the alternative is too unsettling, the possibility that we are, at some fundamental level, completely alone inside our own relationships. And it's not only about being known by others. The question goes even deeper. Because Socrates realized something that took modern psychology decades to confirm. People who don't know themselves are incapable of knowing others, not for lack of will, not out of selfishness, but because the instrument we use to understand the other is always, inevitably, our own internal experience. When that internal experience is opaque, when we don't have clarity about who we are, what we feel, what we truly believe, the gaze we cast on others is also opaque, distorted, filtered through projections, through expectations, through stories we tell ourselves about how people are. This means every relationship you have is to some extent a reflection of the level of self-knowledge you carry. The more you know yourself, the more clearly you can see others. The less you know yourself, the more you see them through fogged glass, thinking you're seeing but actually only projecting. In the streets of Athens, Socrates saw this happen hundreds of times. He saw powerful men who had no idea who they were. He saw artists who believed they understood the human soul but couldn't understand their own. He saw leaders who claimed to know what was good and just, and who collapsed completely before a single, simple, direct question. And it was by observing this pattern repeated relentlessly that he began to develop something. Not an abstract theory, not a philosophical system to be studied in books, but a living method applied in real time, capable of revealing in minutes what years of coexistence conceal. A method that begins exactly where you least expect, not with a great existential question, not with an elaborate philosophical debate, but with something disguised as simple, with something that seems harmless, with something that anyone, upon hearing it, immediately thinks they can answer. And it's in that exact moment, in that instant of confidence, that everything begins to change. If you've ever felt that someone who should have known you acted as if they'd never truly seen you, write in the comments, "I've felt this." So what does it truly mean to know someone? It seems like a simple question. It seems almost redundant, the kind you dismiss before you even finish hearing it, because the answer seems too obvious to deserve attention. And that's exactly why it's so powerful. Because when you stop, when you truly stop and try to answer honestly, you realize the answer doesn't come. Or it comes stumbling. It comes full of vague examples, generalizations, descriptions that speak about behavior but never get close to the essence. Socrates knew this. It was the first move of the method, not the method itself, but the preparation for it. Before questioning the other, he questioned the very terrain of the conversation. He established, calmly and without haste, that the words people use with the most confidence are frequently the ones they can least define. And to know was one of those words. Think about how you'd use that word in everyday life. I've known this person for 10 years. I know my mother better than anyone. I know exactly how he'll react. These phrases come naturally, automatically, loaded with certainty. But what are they actually saying? What's underneath that certainty? In most cases, what we call knowing someone is, in practice, a collection of memories, observed patterns and expectations built over time. It's a mental file we've been assembling, unconsciously, automatically, from the interactions we've had with that person. And that file is useful. It works well most of the time. It gives us a sense of predictability, security, intimacy. But this file has a structural flaw that almost no one notices. It's built from what the person showed, not from what the person is. And these two things, what someone shows and what someone is, can be radically different. People don't present themselves whole, never. Not because they're dishonest, not because they're deliberately hiding something, though that happens too, but because human nature itself operates in layers. There is the layer that appears in casual conversations, the layer that surfaces in moments of joy, the layer that emerges under pressure, the layer that only appears in silence, in solitude, in moments when no one is watching. And there is an even deeper layer, the one the person themselves rarely accesses, that exists below consciousness, that governs decisions and reactions without asking permission. How many of those layers do you know in the people closest to you? How many of those layers do they know in you? Socrates spent years asking questions in the agoras of Athens, the public spaces where the intellectual and social life of the city took place. He talked with all kinds of people, and what he observed repeatedly was that human beings have an almost irresistible tendency to confuse exposure with depth, to confuse the time spent with someone with how much they truly know that person, to confuse familiarity with a face, with knowledge of a soul. And this is not weakness, it's not stupidity, it's a natural mechanism of social survival. Our brain is extremely efficient. It builds mental models of the people around us so we can interact with them without having to process everything from scratch at every encounter. It's a cognitive shortcut. It works, but it has a cost we rarely account for. The model we build is never the person. It's always a simplification, a representation, a reduced version of something far more complex than any model can capture. And here is where Socratic philosophy begins, to become not just interesting, but necessary. Because Socrates wasn't just asking questions out of intellectual curiosity, he was pointing to something he considered the central problem of human existence, the inability to see clearly oneself and others, and the devastating consequences that blindness produces in silence over years inside the most important relationships of our lives. Think about the great disappointments you've lived through, not the small frustrations of daily life, but the ones that truly shook something inside you, the ones that came from people you didn't expect, the ones that arrived from where you least imagined, that betrayal that made no sense, that abandonment that seemed impossible, that reaction that contradicts everything you thought you knew about who was at your side. What do these situations have in common? In almost every case, when you analyze with distance and honesty, there were signs. There were inconsistencies. There were moments when the mental model you'd built about that person didn't match what was happening in reality. And you chose, consciously or not, to trust the model instead of trusting what you were seeing. Because the model was safe. Because the model was familiar. Because dismantling the model meant facing something you weren't ready to face. Socrates called this akrasia, weakness of will in the face of what is comfortable. The human tendency to choose the pleasant illusion when the uncomfortable truth is available. And he saw this pattern everywhere, in political leaders who governed based on false premises about the people they claimed to know, in poets who wrote about the human soul without ever having examined their own, in teachers who taught virtues they couldn't define when pressed. But what makes Socratic thinking different, what separates it from any other philosopher of his era, is not just the diagnosis, it's the fact that he didn't stay in theory. He created something practical, a way to intervene in this pattern in real time, an approach that didn't depend on years of philosophical study, that required no special training, that could be applied in an ordinary conversation, in a public square, between any two people. And the central principle of this method was so counterintuitive that most people, hearing it for the first time, don't believe it can work. Because the secret wasn't in asking difficult things. It was in asking simple things and observing with precision. What happened when the person tried to answer? Simplicity as a tool of revelation. The ordinary question as a mirror no one expected to find. That was the essence of what Socrates developed, and which we're going to begin dismantling piece by piece from here on. Because understanding how the method works is not just an intellectual exercise, it's a shift in perspective that, once it happens, cannot be undone. You begin to hear conversations differently. You begin to notice what's being said between the lines. You begin to identify, with a clarity you didn't have before, the difference between who truly sees you and who only believes they see you. If you've reached this point and are already beginning to question how much you truly know the people around you or how much they know you, write in the comments, "I was wrong." There is something Socrates discovered early, something that took decades for science to confirm. The human mind doesn't like simple questions, not in the way you're thinking. Not because it finds them boring or obvious, but because simple questions are the only ones that offer no hiding place. The only ones that don't allow intelligence to take refuge in complexity to avoid the truth. Think about it. When someone asks you a complex question, a technical matter, an elaborate problem, a dense philosophical dilemma, you have options. You can say you need more time. You can ask for clarification. You can explore nuances. You can build a long, articulate answer that demonstrates sophisticated reasoning without necessarily revealing anything real about you. Complexity is a perfect veil. Intelligent, socially accepted, practically invisible. But when someone asks you a simple question, one that any child could understand, that seems almost naive in its directness, the veil disappears. Suddenly there's nowhere to hide. There's no way to demonstrate intellectual sophistication to sidestep the central point. The question is there, bare, waiting for an equally direct answer. And that's when most people, without realizing it, begin to reveal far more than they intended. Socrates understood this not as an abstract philosophical theory, but as a practical observation, repeated and confirmed over decades of real conversations with real people. He noticed that the confidence with which someone approaches a simple question is inversely proportional to the depth with which that person actually thinks about the subject. In other words, the faster someone thinks they know the answer, the more likely it is they actually don't. And this applies to everything, to philosophical questions about justice and virtue, to emotional questions about love and loyalty, to deeply personal questions about who we are and what we want. The questions that seem simplest are almost always the hardest to answer honestly, because they demand not just knowledge, but self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is the rarest and most demanding thing there is. In the agoras of Athens, Socrates approached people who were recognized as wise, competent, or virtuous in their respective fields. Politicians who governed the city, poets celebrated by the people, craftsmen who mastered their trades with acknowledged expertise. And he always began the same way, with genuine admiration, with apparent respect, with a question that sounded almost like a compliment disguised as curiosity. You, who are so recognized for your wisdom, can you explain to me what courage is? You, who write so beautifully about love, can you tell me what love really is? You, who govern with such authority, can you define for me what justice is? Simple, direct, almost childlike in its phrasing. And invariably, without exception, in every documented conversation, what happened next followed the same pattern. The person answered with confidence, gave a definition, Socrates listened with genuine attention and then asked a second question, equally simple, drawn directly. From the answer just given, the person responded again, perhaps with slightly less confidence. Socrates asked another question, and another, and another. And at some point in that sequence, sometimes quickly, sometimes after many exchanges, the moment arrived. The moment when the person found themselves caught in a contradiction they had built themselves. When their own answers pointed in opposite directions. When it became impossible to maintain the original position without admitting it was insufficient, incomplete, or simply false. That was the moment of aporia, the impasse, the point where the ground disappears. And what happened in that moment revealed, more than any answer ever could, who that person truly was. Because there are basically two possible reactions to aporia. The first, the rarest, the most honest, the one Socrates considered the true beginning of any wisdom, is openness. The genuine recognition that you didn't know what you thought you knew. The intellectual. Humility to say I was wrong or I need to think more about this and feel that as liberation, not as defeat. It's the reaction of someone who uses the impasse as a door, as an entrance to a deeper level of understanding. The second reaction, the most common, the most human, the one Socrates encountered in the vast majority of his conversations, is resistance, anger, the immediate feeling that something was done to you, that it was a trap, that the other person was being dishonest or arrogant or manipulative. The urgent need to defend the original position, not because it's defensible, but because admitting you were wrong feels unbearable. And here is what makes that second reaction so revealing. It has nothing to do with the question. It has to do with identity, with the fact that most people build a significant part of their self-image around what they believe they know. To be questioned on what you know doesn't feel like an intellectual exercise. It feels like a personal attack. A threat to the self, an attempt at diminishment. Socrates was hated for this, deeply, actively hated, not because he was cruel, not because he had malicious intentions, but because the mirror he held up was mercilessly clear, and most people prefer a mirror that lies to one that shows the truth with precision. But what does this have to do with you, with your relationships, with the people you call close? Everything. Because the same principle that governed conversations in the agoras of Athens governs every interaction you have today. The way the people around you respond when questioned, not in philosophical debates, but in everyday conversations, in conflict situations, in the moments when certainties are challenged. That way reveals something fundamental about who they are and about the real quality of the bond you have with them. A person who truly knows you doesn't collapse when you question them, doesn't shut down when you disagree, doesn't treat your different perspective as a threat to their existence, because genuine self-knowledge creates an internal stability that doesn't depend on the other's constant validation. When you truly know who you are, when you genuinely know, not merely believe you know, a difficult question doesn't destroy you, it enriches you. But a person who has built their identity on layers of illusion, who has never genuinely examined what they believe and why they believe it, who confuses the models they hold of themselves with who they actually are, that person will treat any questioning as an attack, will react with defensiveness, anger, withdrawal, not because you did something wrong, but because the mere presence of an honest question threatens a structure they spent years building and never had the courage to examine. Think about the relationships you've had, friendships, romantic relationships, family bonds. Think about the moments when you tried to have an honest conversation, when you expressed a doubt, when you pointed out something that seemed inconsistent. How did the person react? Did they stay open? Did they engage with what you said, even when it was difficult? Or did they shut down, attack, deflect, minimize? The answer to that question isn't just information about that person. It's information about the real level of depth that Bond had. Because real depth, the only kind that withstands time, change, and the pressure of life, only exists where there is mutual openness to honest questioning. Where two people can look at each other without the veils of social performance and tell the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. This is rare. Rarer than we'd like to admit. But it exists. Socrates believed it existed and believed the path to get there passed inevitably through what he called elenchus, the examination. The willingness to examine without mercy and without haste the beliefs we carry about ourselves and about others. And what makes the Socratic method so relevant today, more than 2,000 years later, in a world radically different in technology, in social structure, in the speed of life, is that human nature hasn't changed. The defense mechanisms are the same. The tendency to confuse familiarity with knowledge is the same. The difficulty of sustaining a simple question without resorting to defensiveness is the same. Because the problem was never the era. The problem is the human condition. And the human condition has no expiration date. There is something Socrates said that echoes with unsettling clarity when you stop to think about it. The unexamined life is not worth living. It's not an intellectual provocation. It's a clinical statement about what happens to people who never stop to question what they believe, what they feel, who they are, and who they have beside them. They live. They accumulate years, experiences, relationships, but they live inside a dream they never examined. And when the dream breaks, and it always breaks, because reality is more stubborn than any illusion, the impact is devastating precisely because there was no real foundation underneath. The method Socrates developed wasn't just a conversational technique, it was a summons, a brutal and loving invitation at the same time to step out of the dream and begin to see yourself, others, the bonds you build and what they are actually made of. If you're starting to realize that you may have never asked honest enough questions about the people around you or about yourself, write in the comments, "I had never stopped to think about this." There is a specific moment in every human relationship that most people can never name, but that everyone has lived through. It's the moment when something changes. Not dramatically, not with a fight or an explicit betrayal, not with a clear event you can point to and say, this is where everything fell apart. It's a more subtle change than that. More silent, more unsettling precisely because it has no defined shape, no clear contours, offers no specific place to put the blame or the grief. It's the moment when you look at someone who is beside you, someone you've known for years, someone with whom you've shared real experiences, someone you'd call close without hesitation, and realize with a clarity that hurts that this person is reacting in a way you never would have predicted, that they're saying something that doesn't match who you thought they were, that they're making a choice that contradicts everything you believed you knew about their values, their character, the essence of what made them who they were to you. And in that moment, in that instant of dissonance, the masks fall. Not theirs, yours. Because what falls is not just the illusion you had about that person, it's the illusion you had about the bond, about how much you truly knew them, about the real depth of something you had treated as solid, as certain, as guaranteed. And along with that illusion falls a part of the narrative you'd built about yourself, because part of who you believe you are is always anchored in who you believe you have beside you. Socrates called this moment aporia, the impasse, the Greek word that means literally without passage. The point where the path you were following simply ends, not because you reached your destination, but because the ground disappeared beneath your feet and you realize for the first time that you were walking on a surface that was never as solid as it seemed, But here is what makes Socratic aporia different from a simple human disappointment. Here is what Socrates saw that most people still can't see when they're in the middle of that moment. Aporia is not the end, it's the beginning. And the difference between who understands this and who doesn't determines absolutely everything about what happens next. When the masks fall, when the illusion dissolves, and you find yourself facing a reality that doesn't correspond to the model you'd built, there are two possible paths, and these two paths aren't just different emotional reactions. They are completely distinct existential postures leading to radically opposite destinations. The first path is resistance. It's the path most people choose. Not consciously, not deliberately, but by instinct, by fear, by a deeply human need to maintain internal coherence at any cost. On this path, the impasse is not recognized as revelation. It's treated as threat, as error, as something that needs to be corrected, explained, minimized, or denied so that the previous structure can be restored. You know this path. You've probably walked it. It's when you find clear evidence that someone is not who you thought they were, and you invent a justification. She was stressed. He didn't mean it like that. It's just a phase. Deep down, I know who she is. These are the stories we tell ourselves when reality threatens to dismantle something we need to remain standing. Not because it's true, but because it's familiar. Because we've built parts of our identity around it, because facing the truth would also mean facing the extent of the time we spent believing something that wasn't real. And this is the highest cost of that first path. Not just the cost of maintaining an illusion, it's the cost of losing contact with the very capacity to see. Because every time you choose the mental model over the reality in front of you, you train your perception to ignore signals, to filter out information that contradicts what you want to believe, to build an increasingly distorted version of the world around you, and to live inside that distortion as if it were the truth. Socrates saw this pattern in Athens with a frequency that deeply disturbed him. He saw intelligent, educated, socially successful people living inside narratives completely disconnected from reality, and defending those narratives with an energy that would have been admirable if directed towards something true. He saw entire relationships built on layers of mutual illusion, where neither of the two parties truly saw the other, and neither of the two wanted to be truly seen, because being seen meant being known, and being known meant being vulnerable, and being vulnerable seemed unbearably dangerous. And then there was the second path, the path of openness. This path begins at the same point, the same moment of dissonance, the same impasse, the same disappearing ground, but the response is different. Instead of resisting, instead of inventing justifications, instead of restoring the model that just collapsed, you stop, you breathe, you look at what is in front of you without the rush to conclude, without the need to resolve, without the impulse to make the pain stop as quickly as possible. And you ask the most difficult question there is, what is this showing me? Not about the other person, about you, about what you chose to believe, about the parts of reality you were avoiding seeing, about the signals that were there, that were always there, and that you filtered out because they didn't fit the version you needed to be true. This is what Socrates called the beginning of wisdom, not the accumulation of knowledge, not the ability to answer difficult questions, but the willingness to sustain the impasse without fleeing, to stay in the discomfort of no answer long enough for something real to emerge, to treat the moment the ground disappears not as a catastrophe, but as an opportunity, perhaps the only real opportunity, to see clearly what was hidden before. And here is where this becomes personal in a way that very few people are willing to admit. The greatest disappointments you've ever lived, the ones that genuinely shook something fundamental inside you, didn't come from nowhere. They came from places where there were signs you chose not to see. from people who showed, in small moments, who they really were. And you interpreted those moments as exceptions, rather than revelations. From bonds that had visible cracks you painted over because facing the cracks was harder than continuing to pretend the surface was solid. This is not an accusation, it's a recognition. It's the kind of recognition that Socrates spent his entire life trying to provoke in the people he conversed with. Not to humiliate them, not to demonstrate intellectual superiority, but because he genuinely believed that seeing the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than living inside a comfortable illusion. That the impasse, the aporia, is a gift disguised as rupture. Because on the other side of the impasse there is something that didn't exist before, a clearer perception, a greater capacity to distinguish what is real from what is constructed, a more finely tuned sensitivity to the signals people send about who they truly are, before the ground disappears beneath your feet again. And this sensitivity, this ability to see more clearly, to listen more deeply, to notice what is being communicated beyond words, is not a gift. It's not something some people have and others don't. It's a skill, one that develops. That is practiced. That deepens each time you choose the second path instead of the first. Each time you choose the uncomfortable truth instead of the familiar illusion. Socrates spent decades choosing this path and paid a high price for it. Not only in terms of accumulated social rejection, of enemies made, of legal proceedings, but in terms of what it means to see clearly in a world that prefers the fog. Because whoever sees clearly can no longer pretend they don't see, and whoever can no longer pretend becomes, inevitably, an uncomfortable presence in any environment built on collective illusions. But he also gained something that none of the people who hated him had, something that no amount of social status, public recognition, or material comfort can replace. He knew who he was, and he knew with a precision that very few people ever reach who the people around him were, not the version they presented, not the version they believed themselves to be, the real version, with all the contradictions, all the limitations, all the irreducible complexity that makes a human being a human being. That knowledge, that seeing without veils, was for Socrates the only real form of freedom, the only foundation on which anything true could be built. Any relationship, any friendship, any love, any collaboration worth having, because you cannot build anything real on illusions, no matter how much you want to, no matter how comfortable or familiar or socially accepted the illusion may be. What is built on illusion always falls, and always falls at the worst possible moment, with maximum impact exactly when you most needed it to be solid. What Socrates was offering, what his method offered deep down beyond all the questions and all the impasses, was the possibility of building on something real, of having relationships based not on who you and the other pretend to be, but on who you truly are, with all the imperfections, with all the uncertainties, with all the vulnerability that requires. And that possibility, that openness to the real, always begins in the same place. In the moment the masks fall and you decide consciously and deliberately not to put them back on. This is easier to say than to do. Socrates knew that better than anyone, and that's exactly why what comes next, what he observed happening with people who resisted the impasse, who refused to let the masks fall, who chose illusion over clarity, is perhaps the most unsettling part of everything he left behind. Because the story of Socrates is not just a story about philosophy. It's a story about what happens when truth meets power, and power decides it prefers the lie. If you've lived through a moment when the ground disappeared beneath your feet in an important relationship, a moment when you saw something you could no longer ignore, write in the comments, "I saw without wanting to see." There is a question no one asks about Socrates. And that should be the first. Not what did he teach, not how did his method work, not why was he condemned, but a simpler, more direct, more revealing question than any philosophical analysis can be. Why did people get angry? Not frustrated, not uncomfortable, not mildly annoyed. Angry. With an anger that in many cases lasted for years. That transformed into active enmity, into defamation campaigns, into organized attempts to destroy the reputation of a man who spent his days in a public square asking questions. A man who had no army, no wealth, no political office, no conventional instrument of power or threat. What exactly was this man doing that provoked this level of reaction? The surface answer is well known. Socrates exposed people's ignorance. He asked questions that revealed contradictions. He left interlocutors without answers in front of an audience that observed everything. This created public shame, and public shame, especially in a society where reputation was everything, created enemies. That answer is correct, but it's incomplete because it explains the mechanism, but not the intensity. It doesn't explain why powerful, intelligent, socially sophisticated men reacted to philosophical questions with the same emotional intensity with which they would react to a physical threat. It doesn't explain why the anger didn't pass with time, didn't dissolve, didn't yield to later reflection. To understand this, you need to understand what Socrates was really touching. And it wasn't just intellectual pride, it was something much deeper, much more personal, much more threatening than any public debate could appear to be. He was touching identity, and identity, the narrative a person builds about who they are, what they know, what they're worth, is not just an abstract idea that lives in the head. It's a survival structure. It's the system that organizes perception, filters experience, gives coherence to the chaos of human existence. It's what responds when someone asks, "Who are you?" Not just for others, but for yourself. At 3 in the morning when the silence is too large to ignore. When you question someone's identity. When you ask a simple question that reveals that a central part of the narrative that person has about themselves is inconsistent, incomplete, or simply false, you're not just correcting an intellectual error. You're threatening the entire system. You're pulling a thread that, if pulled to the end, could dismantle a structure that took years to build and that the person needs, at some fundamental level, to believe is real. This explains the anger. It's not a disproportionate reaction, it's a self-preservation reaction, the identity system recognizing a threat and responding with the intensity any existential threat deserves. And Socrates understood this completely. He wasn't naive about what he was provoking. He wasn't surprised when people got angry. He was, in a sense, expecting it. Because he knew that anger was the confirmation that he had touched something real, that he had gotten close enough to the core for the defense system to be activated. What he didn't expect, or perhaps expected and chose to ignore, was the scale this anger could reach when the people affected had enough power to transform personal resentment into public consequence. Think about the kinds of people Socrates questioned. Politicians who governed Athens, generals who had led armies, poets celebrated as custodians of the city's cultural wisdom, sophists who charged fortunes to teach rhetoric and whose entire professional authority rested on the premise that they knew more than others. For a politician, being publicly exposed as someone who cannot define justice, the conceptual foundation of all their power, is not just embarrassing. It's potentially devastating, because political authority, especially in a democracy like Athens, depends on the perception of competence and wisdom. When that perception is shaken, the power that depends on it is shaken too. For a sophist who charges fortunes to teach, being unable to answer basic questions about the concepts he claims to master is not just awkward, It's a direct threat to the entire business model. It's the public exposure of a fraud, even if it's not an intentional fraud, even if the sophist genuinely believes in what he teaches. The practical result is the same: the source of income, status, and professional identity threatened by a man who charges nothing, and who, precisely because he charges nothing, cannot be accused of financial motivation. For a poet, being questioned about the meaning of what they write and not being able to explain it is perhaps the most unsettling of all, because Athens' poets weren't just artists. They were considered vehicles of divine wisdom. They were respected as people who had access to truths that transcended common reasoning. When Socrates conversed with them and discovered they couldn't rationally explain what they had written, that they did it by inspiration, by instinct, by something they couldn't articulate, he wasn't just questioning their competence, he was questioning the source of all the authority they held. And here is where the anger begins to become something more organized, more intentional, more dangerous. Because there is a fundamental difference between the anger of a single humiliated individual and the anger of a group of humiliated individuals who find each other and discover they share the same resentment. Individual anger is volatile but dispersed. Collective anger is focused, persistent, and capable of constructing narratives that transform a philosopher into a public threat. This is exactly what happened in Athens over the years. A silent accumulation of resentments, an informal network of people who had been exposed by the Socratic Method and who carried that exposure not as a lesson learned, but as an unhealed wound. A wound that needed a narrative to make sense of it. And the most convenient narrative was the one that turned Socrates into the villain, the corrupter, the dangerous man who needed to be contained. But there is something in this dynamic that goes far beyond Athens, far beyond the 5th century before Christ, far beyond any specific historical context, because the same pattern that destroyed Socrates exists today. It exists in your relationships. It exists in your work environments. It exists in your families. It exists anywhere truth meets people who have built their identity on illusions that don't want to be questioned. Think about how many times you said something true, not cruel, not aggressive, but true, and were met with a completely disproportionate reaction to what you'd said. How many times you asked an honest question, and the person on the other side reacted as if you had declared war. How many times you pointed out an obvious inconsistency and were treated as an enemy for it. This is not coincidence. It's not bad luck. It's not a problem specific to you or to the person you were talking with. It's the same mechanism that operated in the agoras of Athens, reproduced on a smaller scale, but with the same fundamental logic. Truth meets identity built on illusion. Identity responds with the force necessary to preserve itself. And here is the conclusion Socrates reached after decades of observing this pattern, a conclusion that is simultaneously liberating and profoundly lonely. You cannot force anyone to see what they are not ready to see. No matter how clear the question, no matter how elegant the argument, no matter how irrefutable the evidence, if the person on the other side needs at some fundamental level the illusion to be true, they will find a way to protect it. They will attack the messenger. They will reinterpret the evidence. They will construct an alternative narrative. They will do whatever is necessary to keep the identity structure intact. This doesn't mean truth is worthless. It means truth is only received when there is an openness to receive it. And that openness, that willingness to honestly examine what you believe and who you are, cannot be created from the outside in. It can only be created from the inside out. It can only come from the person themselves, in their own time, through their own experiences and their own choices. What you can do What Socrates did throughout his life is create the conditions for that openness to be possible. Ask the right questions. Be present without imposing. Offer the mirror without forcing anyone to look. And accept, with the serenity that only comes from genuine self-knowledge, that some people will choose the illusion. Not because they're bad, not because they're stupid, but because they're not yet ready for the cost of clarity. And that cost is real. Socrates knew that better than anyone, because he paid the maximum price, not for having done something wrong, not for having been cruel or dishonest or manipulative, but simply for having continued asking questions in an environment that had decided questions were too dangerous to be tolerated. The trial that culminated in his death was not a historical accident. It was not an anomaly. It was the logical consequence of decades of truth in an environment built on illusion. It was the moment accumulated anger found the institutional mechanism necessary to transform itself into a sentence. But what happened at that trial, what Socrates said, how he conducted himself, what he chose in the face of the concrete possibility of dying, reveals something about him that no analysis of the method can capture. It reveals who he was when the masks fell, not on other people, but on himself. When the ground disappeared not beneath an interlocutor in a public square, but beneath him, in front of a tribunal that had the power to decide whether he would live or die. And what he did in that moment is, perhaps, the most important part of the entire story. If you've ever told a truth and been treated as an enemy for it, if you've ever felt the real cost of being honest in an environment that preferred the lie, write in the comments, "I paid for telling the truth." There is a scene that very few people know, and that completely changes the way you understand Socrates. It's not the scene of the trial, not the scene of the hemlock, not any of the dramatic moments that history preserved with the greatest care. It's a smaller scene, more silent, more intimate, and for that very reason, more revealing than any great public moment could be. It's the scene of Socrates applying the method against himself, not as a rhetorical exercise, not as a philosophical demonstration for an audience, but alone, or in deeply private conversations with the few he considered close enough for that level of honesty, asking himself the same questions he asked others, with the same precision, with the same willingness to reach the impasse, with the same refusal to accept comfortable answers that didn't withstand honest examination. And what he found when he turned the method inward was something that most people are never willing to find in themselves. He found a human being full of contradictions, not the perfect sage that posterity so frequently constructs, not the enlightened philosopher who had resolved the great enigmas of existence, but a man who knew that he didn't know, who had doubts he couldn't resolve, who carried fundamental uncertainties about questions he had spent a lifetime investigating, who, after decades of searching, arrived not at certainty, but at something far more valuable and far rarer, clarity about the extent of his own ignorance. "I know that I know nothing." This phrase is perhaps the most quoted in all of Western philosophy, and it is also, paradoxically, the most misunderstood, because most people read it as a statement of performative humility, the kind of thing someone intelligent says to seem even more intelligent, a strategic modesty, a rhetorical device. It was none of that. It was the literal result of decades of self-examination. It was the honest conclusion of a man who had applied the most rigorous method he knew, the same method he used to expose others' ignorance, against himself repeatedly, without mercy and without concessions, and who had arrived through that process not at nothing, but at something very specific, the understanding that real knowledge always begins with the recognition of what you don't know. And here is why this matters to you, to your relationships, to the way you see yourself and see others, because the person you can least easily truly know is not the one who deliberately hides, not the one who uses elaborate masks and sophisticated social performances to keep the world at a distance. The person you can least easily truly know is the one who doesn't know themselves, who has never turned the method inward, who knows everything about others, or believes they know, but has never asked the difficult questions about themselves. And this person exists in every environment you inhabit, is in your circles of friendship, is in your romantic relationships, is probably to some degree inside you yourself. Because genuine self-examination, the kind Socrates practiced, the kind that produces not comfortable certainties but uncomfortable clarities, is one of the rarest and most demanding practices there is. And precisely because it is so demanding, it is the most transformative. Think about how you present yourself to the world. Not the version you consciously choose to show, you've probably examined that to some extent, but the version that emerges automatically without you realizing in situations of pressure, in conflicts, in the moments when you're too tired to maintain the performance, in the instance when the social mask slips because you don't have the energy to hold it in place. Who shows up in those moments? That question is not rhetorical. It's the central question Socrates was asking, not with those words, but through every conversation he began, through every impasse he deliberately created, through every moment of aporia he produced to see what emerged when the interlocutor had nowhere left to hide behind their prepared version of themselves. Because the prepared version is always partial, always a selection. Always, to some degree, a construction, not necessarily dishonest but incomplete, filtered by the need for social approval, by selective memory, by the stories we tell about ourselves to give coherence to an existence that, in all its real complexity, is far more chaotic and contradictory than any narrative can capture. And here is where Socratic thought becomes not just philosophically interesting, but practically urgent for anyone who wants to have real relationships, the kind Aristotle would call perfect friendship, the bond based not on utility or pleasure, but on genuine character. You cannot build a true bond with someone who doesn't know themselves, no matter how much you want to, no matter how willing you are to be vulnerable, to be honest, to create the space for a real connection. If the person on the other side doesn't have access to their own core, if they themselves don't know who they are when the masks fall, then what you're connecting with is not them. It's the version they believe themselves to be, with the character they've constructed, with the narrative they tell about themselves. And narratives change, characters evolve, versions transform. What endures, what is solid enough to be the foundation of something real, is the core, the essence. What Socrates spent his entire life trying to access through questions, and which only reveals itself when the person is willing to turn the method inward, to ask the difficult questions not about others, but about themselves, to arrive at the internal impasse without fleeing. Socrates had a very small circle of people he considered truly close. Not out of elitism, not out of arrogance, but because, after decades of applying the method and observing how people responded to honest examination, he had developed a very precise ability to distinguish who was genuinely willing to pursue self-knowledge and who was only interested in the intellectual performance that resembled self-knowledge but never came close to the real thing. And that small circle, those few people who truly saw him and whom he truly saw, was more valuable to him than any number of public admirers, enthusiastic disciples, people who followed him through the squares of Athens because they found it fascinating but never applied anything they heard to their own lives. Because there is a fundamental difference. A difference Socrates understood with a clarity that few ever reach, between people who admire wisdom and people who live it. between people who find philosophy interesting as an intellectual exercise and people who use philosophy for what it truly is, a tool of transformation, an instrument of clarity, a mirror you choose to look into even when the reflection is uncomfortable. The first kind are the most common. They're the ones who fill conversations with references and concepts and elaborate discussions, and who leave exactly the same as when they arrived. The second kind are rare. They're the ones who come to a conversation with a real question, not a prepared answer, and who leave different. Not necessarily wiser in the sense of having accumulated more information, but more honest, more aware of their own limitations, more open to what they don't know, more willing to revisit what they believed they knew. And it's with these people, only with these people, that true bonds are built, not because the others are bad or incapable, but because real depth requires that both parties be willing to go down, to go beyond the surface, to sustain the discomfort of what is genuine instead of taking refuge in the comfort of what is familiar. Socrates found this in Plato, found it in Alcibiades, in a more complicated, more painful, more revealing way about the limitations that even the best method has when it meets a human nature that prefers the brilliance of performance to the work of self-examination. Found it in a few others whose names history preserved with less care, but whose presence in the conversations that reached us reveals the quality of an attention that is only possible between people who truly see each other. And found it more consistently and more deeply than in any external relationship, in himself, in the daily practice of self-examination, in the willingness to arrive at the internal impasse without fleeing, in the choice, made repeatedly throughout an entire life, to prefer the uncomfortable truth to the comfortable illusion, even when the truth he found was about his own limitations, his own contradictions, his own areas of ignorance that resisted examination. This has a name in the Socratic tradition. It is called epimeleia heautou, the care of the self. Not in the modern sense of self-care, of wellness, of practices to feel better, but in the most demanding and most transformative sense, the care of the soul. The deliberate and continuous attention to what you truly are, what you truly believe, what you truly want, not what society says you should be, believe, and want. And here is what Socrates discovered through that practice. What he found at the bottom of honest self-examination. After removing all the layers of performance, of social expectation, of constructed narrative, that recognized ignorance is infinitely more valuable than illusory knowledge. That the honest impasse is more fertile than the false certainty. That the question you still can't answer tells you more about who you are than all the answers you've ever memorized, and that the people who are willing to live in that productive uncertainty, who can sustain questions without the rush to resolve them, who treat not knowing not as weakness, but as the space where real growth happens, those people are the only ones with whom something true can be built. Not because they're perfect, not because they've arrived at some superior level of wisdom or personal evolution, but because they're willing to be seen, to see themselves, to show up in a relationship not as the finished, polished version they'd like to be, but as the work in progress, full of contradictions and uncertainties and unanswered questions that they truly are. And there is something Socrates knew, something that only comes from living with this quality of attention long enough, that most people discover too late, or never discover at all. The most important relationships of your life will not be with the most intelligent people, not with the most successful, the most admired, the most articulate. They will be with those who are willing to ask the same question as you, not about the world, not about others, but about themselves. The ones who treat self-knowledge not as a destination to be reached, but as a practice to be sustained. the ones who choose repeatedly the uncomfortable clarity over the familiar illusion. These people are rare. Socrates knew that. Aristotle confirmed it. And you, if you stop to think honestly about the bonds you've had and the ones you have now, probably know it too. The question is not about finding perfect people. The question is about recognizing the ones who are on the path, the ones who are trying, even if stumbling, even if going back, even if resisting at times, and building with them something that illusion could never sustain. And to do that, you need something that Socrates spent an entire lifetime developing, and that what follows will examine with all the depth it deserves. You need to know how to recognize who truly knows you, not who says they know you, not who believes they know you, but who, when tested by life, by pressure, by the moment when the masks fall, demonstrates, not with words, but with actions, that what they have is real. If you're realizing that self-knowledge is the foundation of everything, that you cannot be truly known by anyone while you don't know yourself, write in the comments, "I need to know myself first." There is a question Socrates asked, not with words, not in any specific dialogue that history preserved, but with his own life, with every choice he made, with every moment the easy path was available, and he chose the difficult one. The question was this: who do you want to build with? Not who do you want to spend time with, not who you want to have fun with, not who makes you feel good when everything is going well, but who do you want to build with? In the moments when building demands cost, demands renunciation, demands the willingness to be honest when lying would be more convenient, and to stay when leaving would be easier. This distinction between the people with whom you spend time and the people with whom you build is perhaps the most important that exists when it comes to human bonds, and it's also the most ignored, not out of carelessness, not out of lack of intelligence, but because the difference between the two categories is rarely visible under normal conditions of everyday life. Both seem the same when everything is going well. Both offer presence, conversation, the feeling of connection. Both create the illusion of closeness that we confuse with depth. The difference only appears under pressure. It only reveals itself in the moments when something real is at stake, in the moments when the relationship demands more than comfort, more than convenience, more than the pleasant, frictionless version that most relationships manage to maintain, as long as life doesn't present the bill. Socrates spent decades observing what happened to people's bonds under pressure. He saw friendships that seemed solid dissolve the moment one of the parties needed something the other wasn't willing to give. He saw loyalties proclaimed with intensity evaporate when loyalty implied real cost. He saw people who called themselves close disappear exactly when closeness stopped being pleasant and became demanding. And he saw, in contrast, bonds that seemed unlikely, people who had nothing obviously in common, who didn't fit the expected social patterns of friendship, who weren't the natural candidates for deep connection, resist pressures that destroyed apparently much more solid relationships. Because what united them wasn't convenience, wasn't shared pleasure, wasn't mutual utility. It was something more fundamental, mutual recognition of who the other truly was, with all the imperfections and contradictions, and the deliberate choice to stay, and not in spite of that, but with that. This is what Socrates called in essence a true bond, not an abstract philosophical category. A lived reality, recognizable, verifiable, built not in declarations, but in repeated behaviors over time, and especially in the moments when those behaviors have cost. And here is where Socratic philosophy converges with something you already know instinctively. Something your life experience has already confirmed, even if you've never had the words to articulate it with precision. You know who is building with you, not always consciously, not always clearly and articulately, but you know. There is a feeling that can be difficult to name but is impossible to ignore when you stop to pay attention, of which relationships have real weight and which have only volume. which have substance and which have only presence, which would remain if you lost everything that makes it convenient to be at your side, and which would disappear precisely because what made you convenient would no longer be there. This feeling is not paranoia, it's not cynicism, it's relational intelligence, the capacity to perceive, beyond the surface of everyday interactions, what is truly happening in a bond, what sustains it, what limits it, where its real center of gravity lies. Socrates developed this intelligence not as a natural gift, but as the direct result of the method. Because when you spend decades asking questions that reveal who people are beyond the performance, you inevitably develop a capacity to perceive the difference between what is shown and what is real, between what is declared and what is lived, between what the person says about themselves and what they demonstrate being when life presents situations that declarations cannot cover. And what he discovered, what decades of observation confirmed, is that building with someone requires three things that rarely appear together, and that when they do, create something that has no equivalent in any other form of human connection. The first is the mutual willingness for self-examination, not performative self-examination, the kind that appears in conversations as a demonstration of intellectual depth but never gets close to touching anything real. But genuine self-examination, the willingness to look at yourself honestly, to recognize what doesn't work, to question what you believed was right, to arrive at the internal impasse without fleeing. Two people who practice this, each in their own life, at their own pace, with their own depth, create between them a space where honesty is possible in a way that simply doesn't exist in relationships where one or both parties avoid self-examination. Because when you are committed to your own internal clarity, you don't need the other to be perfect. You don't need them to match an ideal. You don't need to protect the illusion you have about them, because you're not invested in illusions, not about them, not about yourself. You can see them as they are, with the limitations, with the contradictions, with the areas they're still working on, and choose to stay not because you're blind to these aspects, but because what you see, seen clearly, is still real enough and valuable enough to justify the choice to build. The second thing is reciprocity at the level of vulnerability. Not vulnerability as strategy, the kind some people use deliberately or unconsciously to create a feeling of intimacy without truly exposing themselves. But real vulnerability, the willingness to show up in a relationship without the full armor, to say what you don't know, to admit where you were wrong, to show the parts you'd prefer to hide, not because they're shameful, but because exposing them means risking being seen in a way you don't control. This is frightening. It always is. For everyone, not just for people who've had experiences of rejection or betrayal, but for any human being intelligent enough to know that being truly seen implies the risk of not being accepted. And that risk never disappears completely. The only thing that changes over time and with practice is your willingness to take that risk anyway. Not because safety is guaranteed, but because you've learned that the cost of never taking that risk is greater than the cost of taking it and occasionally getting hurt. Socrates understood this, and the way he presented himself in conversations, not as the sage who had the answers, but as the investigator who had the questions, was in itself a form of vulnerability, an implicit declaration that he also didn't know, that he was also searching, that the conversation wasn't a performance where he demonstrated superiority, but a genuine encounter where both parties could arrive at something neither could reach alone. This positioning created a specific kind of space, a space where the other person, if willing, could present themselves with the same openness. Not because they were obligated, not because there was social pressure to do so, but because the openness of one party frequently, not always, not with everyone, but frequently, creates the conditions for the other party to also open up. When this happened, when both people arrived at that level of mutual openness, Socrates called it true dialogue. Not in the technical sense of a philosophical discussion format, but in the deepest sense, two souls in real contact. Two human beings who, for a moment, had removed enough layers of performance to truly see each other and be truly seen. These moments were rare. Socrates knew that. But they were, for him, the moments that made life worth living, far more than any public recognition, any intellectual victory, any accumulation of admirers or disciples. The third thing, and perhaps the hardest to find and the easiest to lose, is the commitment to mutual growth. Not the other's growth in the sense of wanting them to change to become what you need them to be, but commitment to the growth of both, the willingness to celebrate when the other expands beyond the limits you knew in them, even if that expansion creates discomfort, even if it changes the dynamic between you, even if it means the relationship needs to reconfigure itself to accommodate who you're both becoming. This last part is where many relationships that begin with real depth eventually get stuck, because genuine growth is unsettling. It's unpredictable. It changes people in ways they themselves don't anticipate. And a relationship that was built around who two people were at a given moment, no matter how genuine that bond was, can become a cage when one of the parties begins to move beyond the contours that defined the original connection. Socrates saw this happen. He saw people who had had real bonds become mutual obstacles to each other's growth, not out of malice, but because the love they felt was anchored in a version of the other that had been left behind. Because holding on to the person you knew is easier than accompanying the person they're becoming. Because accompanying requires that you also move, that you also grow, that you're also willing to be unsettled by what is emerging in the other. And this requires something that only exists in relationships truly built on mutual self-knowledge. The capacity to love, not the version you know, but the person who is revealing themselves. Not the mental map you built, but the living and moving territory that the map can never fully capture. Think about the people in your life right now, not all of them, the ones you consider most important, and ask for each of them the three questions that emerge from what you just heard. Does this person practice self-examination? Not in performance, in real life, in the conversations you have with them, in the way they respond when questioned, when they make mistakes, when the ground disappears. Is there evidence beyond words that they are committed to their own internal clarity? Is there real reciprocity and vulnerability? Do you feel seen by them, not the version you present, but the version you are? And do you see them in the same way? Is there a space between you where honesty is possible without the constant fear that honesty will destroy the bond? And is there a commitment to mutual growth? When you change, when you expand beyond the contours they knew in you, do they celebrate or resist? When they grow, can you accompany them? Or do you hold on to the version of them that fit better in the space you had created together? These three questions don't have absolute right or wrong answers. They have degrees. They have better and worse moments. They have areas where a relationship is strong and areas where it's still being built. And the goal is not to find relationships that answer all three perfectly. The goal is to have clarity about what you have, what is being built, and what still needs to be developed. Because building with someone is not a state you reach. It's a process, a choice that renews itself, a practice that demands continuous attention, not the anxious attention of someone who's always checking if the bond is still intact, but the loving attention of someone committed to the growth of something they consider valuable. Socrates spent his entire life in that practice. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, not without moments when the method failed, not without relationships that began with real depth and ended in rupture, but with a consistency and intentionality that few people ever reach. the consistency of someone who genuinely believes that true bonds are the most valuable thing life offers, that they are worth the cost, that they justify the risk, that they make bearable, even beautiful, the weight of an existence that without them would be only a series of events without a connecting thread. And in the end, in the most extreme moment of his life, the moment when everything he had built was placed on the scale, it was exactly in those bonds that Socrates found what he needed to make the choice he made, a choice that most people, hearing about it from a distance, find incomprehensible. That seems irrational, even masochistic, even absurd in its refusal to yield to what it would have been easy to yield to. But that, for anyone who understands what was at stake, for anyone who understands what Socrates had built over an entire lifetime of self-examination and true bonds, is not just comprehensible. It's inevitable. If you know who the people you're truly building with are, if you have clarity about who in your life answers the three questions with honesty and consistency, write in the comments, "I know who I'm building with." In 399 BC, Socrates was brought to trial. The charges were two: impiety, for not recognizing the gods of the city and for introducing new divinities, and corrupting the youth, for influencing young Athenians with ideas that the authorities considered dangerous to social stability. The trial was conducted before a jury of 500 citizens. The penalty proposed by the prosecution was death. Socrates was 70 years old, and he had, at that moment, all the tools necessary to survive. He could have apologized. He could have promised to stop asking questions. He could have accepted exile, an alternative that was offered and that would have meant the continuation of life in another place, under different conditions, but life. He could have used the eloquence that decades of philosophical conversation had refined to construct a persuasive argument that would have convinced the jury of his innocence. Not real innocence, but the version of innocence the jury needed to hear to vote for acquittal. He did none of that. What he did, what is documented in Plato's Apology, the closest account we have of what happened in that courtroom, was something that shocked those present, irritated the jury, sealed his fate, and has continued to disturb philosophers, historians, and ordinary people for more than 2 millennia. He told the truth, not the strategic truth, not the truth calibrated to produce the desired result, but the whole truth, without ornament, without concession to what the jury wanted to hear, including the part that practically guaranteed his condemnation. He said he would not stop philosophizing, that if he were acquitted on the condition of silence, he would refuse the acquittal, that obeying his conscience, the inner voice he called his daemon, the guide that had directed him throughout his life, was an obligation that could not be negotiated, not even for the price of life itself. And then he said something that was etched into history, not just as a philosophical declaration, but as one of the most radical and unsettling statements a human being has ever made in the face of their own imminent death. The unexamined life is not worth living, not as provocation, not as last-minute philosophical performance, but as the honest synthesis of everything he had learned about himself, about others, about what makes human existence something more than a series of meaningless events. The jury voted for condemnation by a relatively small margin, 280 votes to 220, which, considering the circumstances, is almost more unsettling than a unanimous condemnation would have been. Because it means that 220 people hearing everything, including the parts that made condemnation more likely, still voted for life, but 280 voted for death, and the sentence was pronounced. Socrates' friends organized an escape. Crito, one of the closest, one of those who would answer the three questions with honesty and consistency, came to the prison personally to present the plan. There was money, there were connections, there was a safe route out of Athens, everything was ready. Socrates refused, and the reason he gave, preserved in the dialogue. Crito, another text by Plato, is the one that completes the circle of everything we've seen up to this point. The one that connects the method, the self-examination, the true bonds, the cost of honesty, and the central question that runs through this entire video from one end to the other. He said that fleeing would be a contradiction, that spending an entire life teaching that the laws of the city must be respected, that the order that makes community life possible has a value that transcends individual interest, and then violating those laws at the moment when violating them would be personally convenient, would be exactly the kind of inconsistency that the Socratic method had spent decades exposing in others. It would be doing exactly what he had condemned in every interlocutor he encountered in the agoras, defending one thing with words and living another with actions. It wasn't about the laws. It was about integrity, about the coherence between what you say you believe and what you do when believing has real cost, about the fact that self-knowledge without consistency is not self-knowledge. It's just another form of illusion, more sophisticated than most, but illusion all the same. Socrates drank the hemlock 30 days after the sentence. He died surrounded by his closest friends, the ones who answered the three questions, the ones who had built with him over years, the ones who knew him not by the public version, but by the real version, with all the contradictions and all the certainties and all the irreducible complexity that made him who he was. He died in conversation, because that was how he lived. That was how he processed existence. It was through genuine dialogue that the world made sense to him. And he died, according to all accounts, with a serenity that profoundly disturbed those present. Not the serenity of the indifferent, not the serenity of someone who had given up wanting to live, but the serenity of someone who had examined their own life with sufficient depth to know who they were, what they believed, and what they were willing to pay to remain consistent with that until the end. Now, why does this matter to you? Why does the death of a 70-year-old Greek philosopher more than 2 millennia ago, in political circumstances completely different from the ones you live in, have any relevance to your life, to your bonds, to the questions you carry about who truly knows you and who only believes they know you? Because what Socrates demonstrated, not with words but with the final choice of an entire life, is something that no philosophical argument can convey with the same force as a lived example. That there is an absolute, irreducible, and consequential difference between knowing something and being that something, between understanding a principle and living according to it when living according to it has cost, between knowing who you are in the easy moments, when life is cooperating, when the people around you are satisfied with you, when being who you are implies no sacrifice, and knowing who you are in the moments when being who you are demands the highest imaginable price. This is what the Socratic method was ultimately seeking in every conversation. Not intellectual consistency, existential consistency. Coherence between what the person believes themselves to be and what they demonstrate being when the demonstration carries real weight. And that coherence, when you find it in a person, when you realize they are the same in the easy moments and in the difficult ones, that what they defend with words is what they live with actions, that the public version and the private version aren't different characters but expressions of the same core, that coherence is the most reliable signal there is that you are in the presence of someone who truly knows themselves, and someone who truly knows themselves can truly know you, can create the space where you can also truly know yourself, can build with you something that doesn't depend on external conditions to endure, something that resists pressure, change, time, the circumstances that destroy everything built on illusion. This is what Socrates was offering. Not a philosophical system, not a method of argumentation, but an invitation made with questions, made with his own life, made with his own death, to examine, to question, to arrive at the impasse without fleeing, to discover at the bottom of the most honest self-examination you can sustain, who you truly are. And then, with that clarity, with that courage, with that willingness to be seen in the same way you've learned to see, to build, with the right people, in the right bonds, in the way that transforms not only the relationships you have, but the person you become through them. Because in the end, at the end of everything, when you remove the performance and the noise and the artificial urgency of daily life, what remains are the questions you had the courage to ask, the truths you chose not to avoid, the bonds that withstood the weight of the real, and the version of you that emerged from all of that. Not perfect, not finished, not without contradictions and uncertainties and areas that are still being worked on, but real, examined, coherent enough to be the foundation of something worth building. Socrates spent 70 years making that choice every day. And when the moment came, when the choice cost everything, he made it. Again, without hesitation, with the serenity of someone who knows that consistency is not a philosophical concept. It's who you are when no one is watching. It's who you are when the cost is real. It's who you are when the method you applied to others arrives inevitably at you. The question that remains, the question Socrates left for everyone who came after, for everyone who heard the story and wondered what they would have done in his place, is not about philosophy. It's not about abstract courage. It's not about virtue as a theoretical concept. The question is simple, direct, the kind that seems easy to answer until you try for real. Who are you when being who you are has cost? That question doesn't need an answer right now, doesn't need to be answered out loud, doesn't need to be shared, doesn't need to be resolved in a hurry. It just needs to be carried with honesty, with attention, with the willingness to let it do the work that only true questions can do. The work of revealing, of clarifying, of showing with the precision that no prepared answer can imitate who you truly are, and who, beside you, is real enough to walk with you while you find out. If this video touched something real in you, if any part of this story stayed with you, write in the comments, Socrates was right. Not as a slogan, as a recognition that the pursuit of genuine self-knowledge, as uncomfortable as it is the only one truly worth not abandoning. And if you made it all the way here, if you stayed from beginning to end, if you carried the questions along, if you recognized yourself somewhere in this journey, thank you, genuinely. Not for the audience, for the willingness to examine. That is rare, and it's exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. In the next video, we will meet a man who took everything Socrates taught and carried it into the most unlikely place imaginable for philosophy, the center of absolute power. An emperor who governed the greatest empire in the known world, and who, every night before sleep, wrote to himself the truths he could not say out loud to anyone. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher who governed Rome, the man who discovered that the greatest enemy of a leader is not outside, it's within, and who left, in the pages of a diary that was never written to be published, the most honest map that exists for anyone who wants to govern their own mind before trying to govern anything else. Subscribe, activate the bell, and come back, because this conversation still has much more to reveal.